In communications work, there's a point where systems stop being tools and begin becoming environments. Most people never notice the transition when it happens. At first, a surveillance system exists for a specific reason. Maybe it's because of a war, a riot, a bombing campaign, terrorist attack, or a diplomatic crisis. Something immediate and concrete. The system is justified as temporary, targeted, and necessary. Then the emergency fades, but the system remains. Tonight, we're going to examine 3 different intelligence programs and the architecture behind them. The NSA's diplomatic surveillance program, codenamed Dropmire, the FBI's Ghetto Informant program, the Hemisphere Project, and the broader domestic intelligence machinery that grew around informants during the Cold War and the unrest of the 1960s and 1970s. This is not an episode about conspiracy theories. These programs are historically documented. Congressional investigations examined them, journalists exposed them, and intelligence officials defended them. The unsettling part is not that they existed. It's how ordinary they became. Because once a government learns that certain methods of information gathering can shape events before a crisis occurs, the temptation to collect more information rarely shrinks. It expands. And eventually, entire communities become listening posts.
You're listening to the Partisan Comms Podcast.
There is a signal broadcast every second of every day through our television sets.
Welcome to episode 24. I'm Terrence. When Edward Snowden leaked classified NSA documents in 2013, much of the public attention focused on domestic surveillance programs, metadata collection, and the scale of electronic monitoring after September 11th. But buried inside those disclosures were documents describing something older, quieter, and in many ways more traditional, which was diplomatic espionage. The NSA had targeted foreign embassies and diplomatic missions, including allied governments. These were not hostile states or wartime enemies. They were allies. Codenamed Dropmire, the documents describe surveillance against European Union diplomatic facilities in Washington, New York, and Brussels. Intelligence collection methods included antenna interception systems, cable traps, implanted monitoring devices, and compromised communications equipment. One document referenced an implant placed inside an encrypted fax system used by the European Union Embassy in Washington, D.C., and it illustrated something important about communication systems that we have discussed previously, which is people often imagine secure communications as a binary state. That is to say, they view them as secure or insecure, encrypted or compromised, but reality is less dramatic and more dangerous. A perfectly encrypted transmission can still be captured if the device generating it has already been penetrated. And that appears to have been the logic behind this program. Rather than breaking encryption directly, intelligence services targeted the systems surrounding it. The embassy believed it was sending protected diplomatic traffic back to Europe. Meanwhile, the system itself had reportedly become the listening posts. And the purpose was not necessarily military intelligence in the traditional sense. The leaked document suggested the United States wanted insight into internal disagreements between European governments. Disagreements over trade negotiations and policy fractures, which could be used as diplomatic leverage. The target was not only information, it was anticipation, knowing what allies privately believed before negotiations began, understanding which governments were divided, and using this information to determine where pressure could be applied. This same logic appeared during the 2009 G20 meetings in London, where British intelligence services reportedly conducted extensive surveillance against visiting delegations.
A German news source says the U.S. government is using its PRISM program to spy on EU diplomats. We're joined right now by an elected official from the EU, Rebecca Harms, president of the Green Party in the European Parliament. Rebecca, welcome to Street Smart.
Hello.
Now, you've called for a special committee to investigate these snooping claims and would like to cancel existing agreements between the EU and the U.S. if these accusations are not addressed. What do you need to hear right now from the U.S. government that would make you more comfortable?
So, first of all, I think it's not done with any explanations. So in the European Parliament we feel the deep need to really investigate what has happened in all these PRISM and Tempora activities. So we have not only the problem with the United States, we have also the problems with Tempora, which has been organized by the UK Secret Service. And my point of view right now is that information from the US side is one first step. What this will not be sufficient to not go for deeper inquiry in the European Parliament.
The German magazine Der Spiegel and Britain's Guardian newspaper claim to have evidence showing that the United States National Security Agency bugged the European Union mission in New York and its embassy in Washington. The EU summoned the US ambassador and ordered a sweep of its offices to check for devices. Stefan Seibert, a spokesperson for German Chancellor Angela Merkel, said Washington needs to explain.
Every country in the world that is engaged in international affairs of national security undertakes lots of activities to protect its national security, and all kinds of information contributes to that.
It might turn into an EU internal problem. It might be that the problem is less the fact that US authorities have been spying on some EU delegations, offices, some embassies. But I think the key problem will be rather the issue of personal data sharing.
The size and reach of the alleged NSA surveillance have outraged European leaders. French President François Hollande called it unacceptable. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, whose cell phone was allegedly tapped by the U.S., said her trust has been severely shaken. And at an EU gathering in Brussels, Germany's Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle demanded the truth.
For us, spying on close friends and partners is totally unacceptable. This undermines trust, and this can harm our friendship.
The White House has denied the most serious charges, saying the United States is not monitoring and will not monitor the German leader's communications. But less clear is whether it did so in the past. European Parliament President Martin Schulz expressed disbelief.
I asked United States officials if this is true. They said perhaps because of anti-terror measures. I could guarantee the European Parliament is not planning terrorist attacks on the United States.
Unless Americans prove the allegations untrue, Schulz recommends suspending talks on the two-way free trade agreement between Europe and the United States. European leaders have downplayed those remarks, but trade expert Stephen Szabo at the Transatlantic Academy says the alleged spying complicates ongoing negotiations.
I think what will happen is this whole issue of data privacy, which is something the French have been pushing on very hard, will now become a much more tougher issue. The Germans have been much more open to having an agreement on data privacy, and I think now this is going to make it more difficult.
U.S. trade officials insist conversations regarding NSA surveillance be handled separately from trade negotiations. But Szabo says a controversy could give European companies the upper hand.
It's bad news for American companies, IT companies like Google and Apple and so on, because now you have the European and German firms saying, go with us because we can protect your data. So it's going to hurt, it's going to cost billions of dollars to American companies.
Experts say a transatlantic trade pact could be the biggest bilateral trade deal in history, representing half of the world's total economic output and about 30% of global trade.
According to documents later reported by The Guardian, intelligence agencies established internet cafes used by Delegates then monitored email traffic and captured keystrokes through keylogging software. BlackBerry devices were targeted and phone calls were intercepted. Analysts reportedly monitored live call traffic during negotiations using visualization systems that displayed which delegations were communicating in real time. One internal review reportedly celebrated that analysts could watch conversations and communication patterns develop live as the summit unfolded. That example is important because it demonstrates a transition in intelligence philosophy. This was no longer simply collecting information for archives or future analysis. This was operational intelligence designed to influence events while they were happening. And minutes mattered, conversations mattered. Who spoke to whom before a negotiation session mattered. And eventually, officials inside international institutions began behaving as though surveillance was simply part of diplomatic life. Former United Nations officials described avoiding sensitive discussions indoors. Some preferred walking meetings outdoors rather than speaking inside offices they assumed were monitored. And that assumption may sound paranoid to modern ears, but depending on what type of environment one is working in, assuming you are being monitored is considered professionalism, not paranoia. And that matters in this context because over time, systems built for exceptional circumstances stop feeling exceptional and they become infrastructure. And eventually, the same mindset that justified monitoring embassies abroad would begin shaping intelligence collection inside the United States itself. Of course, intelligence collection activities on American soil is not new. The Ghetto Informant program emerged during a period when the federal government increasingly feared urban unrest inside the United States. For example, the Watts riots in 1965 were followed by violence in Newark and Detroit. Cities burned and National Guard units were deployed, and as a result, political leaders began speaking about civil disorder, using language that resembled wartime planning. The federal response operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Publicly, there were commissions and reports. The Kerner Commission attempted to study the causes of unrest and social fragmentation. Meanwhile, privately, intelligence agencies prepared for the possibility of widespread domestic instability. In 1967, Attorney General Ramsey Clark sent a letter to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover describing concern about organized violence emerging from urban communities. The letter emphasized the need to develop intelligence sources capable of monitoring unrest before it erupted. And from that environment, the Ghetto Informant program was born. At its height, the program reportedly utilized more than 7,000 informants. And the scale of that alone is difficult to visualize, but the structure is what makes the program significant because the FBI didn't simply recruit informants inside revolutionary organizations. The program expanded into ordinary neighborhoods. Internal memoranda described the use of local business owners, such as barbers and shopkeepers, as community listening posts. And that phrase deserves some attention, listening posts, because these were not investigators, witnesses, or criminal informants, and this term is not being used to describe intelligence collection of a foreign adversary or even an ally to gain an advantage at the negotiating table. Listening posts in this context implies something broader and more passive, which is an environment where an intelligence system is embedded into daily life. The barbershop becomes an observation point, the corner store becomes an informant node, and conversations become intelligence. And importantly, the program operated without the kind of judicial oversight associated with search warrants or wiretaps. And the rationale for this program was preventative. Authorities believed riots and civil disturbances could be anticipated through information gathering at the community level. And initially, the focus centered on unrest and violence, but as often happens with intelligence systems, the mission expanded. Informants monitored bookstores, political organizations, student groups, black nationalist movements, and civil rights figures. and the program overlapped with broader FBI operations, including COINTELPRO, and investigations into what the Bureau categorized as extremist activities. And eventually, the difference between preventing violence and collecting political intelligence became increasingly unclear. Informants were tasked with identifying organizational structures, ideological disputes, relationships between activists, and the circulation of literature considered subversive.
In the summer of 1978, I interviewed a man who worked as an informer for the FBI during the 1960s. His name is Darthard Perry, also known as Ed Riggs, also known as Bill Perry, also known as Othello. How were you paid?
The pay was always in cash. Cash, and you would sign a card. It would go like this. A rendezvous or a drop-off point would be picked out either by yourself or the agent. You would meet the agent there. Usually it would be in a vehicle. You get in the vehicle, he would hand you the money. He would tell you first to count the money. He would tell you the amount while you counted it. If the amount was there, he would then bring out a card. On that card would be for the week of such and such. In other words, the week was dated. So-and-so has been paid the amount of. Then you would sign the card, and then the agent would sign the card. The reason for this is that if all of a sudden the IRS became very interested about where you were getting all this extra money from, you could always tell them to go back to the Bureau, and the Bureau would have your cards on file.
I see. Were there such things as bonuses?
Oh, yes.
What were they paid for?
Bonuses were paid for, suppose while you were meeting with, or you were at a meeting with Bobby Seals, Chulai of the Red Army happened to come to the meeting too, which is something which would be a new development. That's bonus time.
In other words, a hot piece of information.
Hot piece, very hot piece.
Did you ever suffer pangs of conscience?
Quite a few times. Quite a few times. I still suffer pangs of conscience. I suffer from the fact that a lot of people trusted me, and I misused that trust. I suffer from the fact that a lot of information that I gave out was the undoing of certain groups or certain people.
You also were active in the infiltration of many cultural groups. Before we go into that step by step, how much research and study did the FBI engage in of black culture in the late 60s?
A great amount.
Give me an idea.
From the thing is, I can, they have a file on every type of magazine that blacks read. They have a file on the music.
Music?
Music, dance, theater, actors, comedians, you name it, man.
And they would actually study these different...
Yes. Oh, yes, definitely.
What would they do with music?
To understand the people, you have to understand the culture. To infiltrate, you have to understand. You had a lot of so-called white liberals that were infiltrating the so-called black groups using the information that they had gathered from the studies of blacks.
You mean just to understand the behavior pattern of our people?
Oh, yeah. I can, Will Heaton could name out some jams of Miles Davis that I hadn't even heard of. He could name off some books that I hadn't even read pertaining to black culture.
Did you ever see agents actually studying the music of...
Yes, yes. Yes, I've seen them going over even video portion of cultural events. The understanding, like when, okay, you have an organization like Leroy Jones' Black House. You remember that? Okay, Leroy Jones's place, which was done on the thing of tribalism. That's where I first heard the word Kintu, Mantu, Hantu, Hentu. These words of the African continuum. I learned that from an agent. He ran it down to me. They make in-depth studies of the personalities of the people they're dealing with too. Culturally, it always helps it's the thing of you can take their culture and use it against them.
How large would you say an extensive collection on our culture would you say the FBI has? Would you rate it as large as a particular library, like the Schomburg Library in Harlem? Or
I would rate it better. I would rate it better, and the fact is that they go into details that we probably would overlook. Will Heaton used to meet me in different places. Will Heaton, that was one of my supervising agents. There is a certain bar in the Los Angeles area where people into black cultural things met, and Will Heaton used to meet me there. And he would go into very long and tiring conversations with some very articulate brothers about culture, African culture, and Afro-American culture.
Tell me about some of the cultural organizations that you infiltrated and what you did.
PASLA, Mafunde, Watts Writers Workshop, which they had.
The Watts Writers Workshop?
Yes. Watts Writers Workshop, which was one of the oldest established black writers workshop.
That place was burned down.
Yeah. The Bureau had it burnt down.
How do you know that?
I know because I participated. I did the arson.
You burned down the Watts Writers Workshop?
Yes.
Why did they want it to go?
At the time, funding had been cut to the workshop, had been cut out, but it looked like there was a possibility of a grant being given back to the workshop. And if there was no theater, there would be no grant.
How did you do it?
2 cans of kerosene, a Purex bottle, gasoline, and a flare, highway flare.
Why didn't you use more sophisticated stuff?
Oh, no. No. You're never overly sophisticated. It's too obvious.
Under this program, the surveillance environment widened from specific threats to entire social ecosystems. And that transition is important because it reflects a recurring pattern in intelligence history, where a system built to monitor potential violence begins monitoring influence, and then ideology and association. And once a system reaches that point, almost any conversation can potentially become relevant intelligence. The Church Committee investigations in the 1970s later revealed just how expansive this approach had become. Informants were often expected to report anything and everything, and that phrase appears repeatedly in testimony surrounding domestic intelligence operations. Not reporting just merely criminal plans or violent rhetoric, everything, such as personal relationships, membership lists, financial concerns, internal disagreements, and political opinions. And the result was not simply surveillance of events, it was social mapping. And social mapping changes the psychological terrain of communities, whether people realize it or not. Because once citizens begin believing conversations may be monitored, behavior changes long before enforcement occurs. People speak differently, organizations become cautious, and trust deteriorates. And it's not always dramatically. Often it's quietly and incrementally. One of the most revealing aspects of the Church Committee investigations was not merely the existence of informants, but the scope of what they collected. Former informants testified that they reported virtually everything they observed inside targeted organizations. One FBI official described informants as vacuum cleaners of information, and that phrase captures the mentality precisely because the goal was comprehensive awareness, and intelligence investigations often differed fundamentally from criminal investigations because they didn't necessarily require evidence of a specific crime, and instead the emphasis was anticipatory. Political movements were mapped, leadership structures identified, personal vulnerabilities were documented, and associations were recorded. One of the clearest examples involved Mary Jo Cook, an FBI informant inside the Vietnam Veterans Against the War organization during the 1970s. Cook later testified that she was expected to attend meetings, identify members, understand relationships within the organization, and report broadly on activities and personalities. Importantly, she eventually became part of the organization's leadership structure, and her successful infiltration of this group demonstrated how intelligence collection can evolve from observation into participation. Cook later explained that it became impossible to gather the level of information requested by the FBI without becoming deeply integrated into the organization itself, and the reporting extended far beyond criminal activity. She described collecting information about who people associated with, who they lived with, their interpersonal conflicts, and coalition work involving churches, civil liberty groups, and anti-war organizations. Over time, Cook reportedly became increasingly uncomfortable with the gap between the FBI's assumptions and the reality she observed. The organization was politically active, certainly critical of the government, and radical in some areas, but not the violent threat intelligence framework sometimes implied, and that realization eventually caused her to leave the operation. Her testimony later revealed something important about intelligence systems, that once information enters the system, context can sometimes disappear. Raw information survives longer than nuance, and the machinery rewards collection, not necessarily understanding. At the same time, the historical record also demonstrates that informants sometimes prevented real violence. Gary Rowe's infiltration of the Ku Klux Klan is an example. Rowe operated as an FBI informant inside certain Klan organizations during the civil rights era, and information from informants contributed to investigations involving bombings, beatings, and murders. In some cases, intelligence clearly disrupted planned violence. But Rowe's case also revealed another moral problem inherent in infiltration operations, and that is to maintain credibility inside violent groups. Informants sometimes participated in violence themselves. Rowe later described accompanying Klansmen during attacks and beatings because refusing participation could expose him. One FBI handling agent summarized the dilemma bluntly when he stated that Rowe couldn't be an angel and be a good informant. And that sentence contains the ethical gravity of the entire system because intelligence agencies increasingly found themselves operating inside the very violence they were attempting to monitor. Not directing it necessarily, but adjacent to it, embedded with it. And that proximity created unavoidable questions. At what point does observation become involvement? At what point does infiltration distort the environment being monitored? At what point does intelligence gathering begin shaping events rather than merely recording them? And those questions became even more complicated as surveillance targets expanded beyond violent organizations, such as student groups, anti-war organizations, women's liberation movements, and political conferences. Even public debates concerning missile defense systems were monitored in some cases if authorities suspected ideological influence or extremist association, and the underlying assumption was that instability could emerge from networks long before violence appeared. And once intelligence systems adopt that assumption, surveillance naturally broadens. And that's one reason intelligence programs rarely shrink voluntarily. The infrastructure develops institutional momentum, budgets grow, databases expand, and personnel specialize. And eventually, entire bureaucracies depend on the continuation of the mission even when the original crisis fades. There's a noticeable transition point in the history of surveillance programs. At first, intelligence collection depended on people. An informant attends a meeting, a source inside an organization would report conversations, an undercover operative infiltrates a movement. That system relied on human presence, human memory, and human reporting. But eventually, communications infrastructure itself began replacing the traditional informant. And that transition was visible in a program known as the Hemisphere Project. Publicly revealed in 2013 through Freedom of Information Act disclosures, the Hemisphere Project was a partnership between AT&T and the federal government, primarily operating through the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Unlike many surveillance discussions that focus on intercepted content, Hemisphere centered primarily around metadata. Not what people said, but who called whom, when they called, how long they spoke, and where the devices were located. And more importantly, how those relationships changed over time, because metadata often sounds abstract until you understand what pattern analysis actually does. A single phone call means very little. Thousands of calls over years begin creating social geometry. Patterns emerge, relationships emerge, movement and networks also emerge. And according to disclosures surrounding the program, AT&T maintained access to enormous volumes of call detail records routed through its infrastructure. Importantly, this included not only AT&T customers, but also calls passing through AT&T switches from other carriers. And that detail significantly expanded the scope of the system.
The federal government is being ordered to release internal documents on its domestic covert spying program.
AT&T has legally spied on its customers. The Daily Beast reports AT&T used a secretive, for-profit program called Project Hemisphere for years. It was used for a wide number of functions, from investigating homicides to Medicare fraud. It searches trillions of call records and analyzes cellular data to determine where a target is located, with whom he or she speaks, and potentially why.
In Project Hemisphere, employees from AT&T work alongside federal and local law enforcement to help those law enforcement officials mine through this database of trillions of call records when they need them for certain cases. Now, they're able to cast such a wide net because not only does this AT&T database have information from AT&T customers, it also has information from other customers who use AT&T switches, so whose calls go through AT&T channels, AT&T's equipment.
The database reportedly accumulated billions of call detail records daily, with archives extending back to 1987. And that date matters because it means the system preserved decades of communications relationships. Not recordings of conversations necessarily, but something arguably more enduring. Association. The architecture itself reflected the increasingly blurred boundary between state surveillance and private infrastructure. AT&T employees reportedly worked directly inside law enforcement environments in Houston, Atlanta, and LA. Their salaries were funded through federal drug control programs, but the infrastructure itself remained deeply connected to private telecommunication systems. And this is probably one of the most important developments in modern surveillance history, that the network becomes the listening post, not the barbershop or the storefront, not the informant sitting quietly in the back of the meeting. The infrastructure itself begins observing society continuously. And unlike traditional surveillance operations, Project Hemisphere emphasized speed and persistence. Investigators could reportedly obtain records in hours rather than days. Administrative subpoenas, not warrants approved by judges, were frequently sufficient enough to access information. And that's a critical point because a warrant generally requires probable cause and judicial oversight. Administrative subpoenas operate differently. They are often issued directly through investigative authority itself, and the result was a system capable of rapidly mapping relationships and communication patterns across enormous timescales without the procedural visibility normally associated with courtroom scrutiny. And over time, the system reportedly developed increasingly sophisticated analytical capabilities. One feature, for instance, allowed analysts to identify what were called drop phones. If an individual abandoned one phone number and transitioned to another device, pattern analysis could reportedly identify the replacement number by examining overlapping communication behaviors and relationship structures. Another capability reportedly identified associated numbers used by the same person or network. So in practical terms, the system was no longer simply collecting records, it was modeling human behavior. And that represents a profound change in surveillance philosophy because traditional intelligence operations often focused on specific suspects. Modern analytical systems increasingly focus on relational structures themselves. For instance, who communicates with whom, how often, at what intervals, and from what locations, across what duration. And because metadata analysis functions probabilistically, the scope naturally expands beyond confirmed criminal actors. Anyone connected to the network may become visible. And that reality produced criticism from civil liberties organizations and privacy advocates, particularly after disclosures suggested that law enforcement agencies were instructed not to reference Hemisphere directly in official reports or court filings. Instead, agencies reportedly utilized what became known as parallel construction. The process worked like this. Investigators would use Hemisphere internally to identify relationships or phone numbers. Then they would issue a second subpoena directly to a telecommunications provider and cite only the secondary request in official documentation. And the original analytical pathway remained hidden. The concern was not merely secrecy, it was also visibility. Judges, defense attorneys, and the public often could not see how the investigative trail truly began, and that detail connects Hemisphere directly back to the earlier intelligence programs we discussed. The technologies changed, the architecture evolved, but the underlying logic remained remarkably familiar. Build systems capable of reducing uncertainty before crisis emerges. Map associations before actions occur, and observe networks continuously rather than episodically. The Ghetto Informant program embedded listening posts inside neighborhoods. Hemisphere embedded listening posts inside telecommunications infrastructure itself. And once communication systems become persistent intelligence environments, surveillance no longer requires an informant physically present in the room. The network remembers instead. Even years later, after phones are discarded, relationships fade, and that may ultimately be the defining characteristic of modern intelligence systems, not simply because their ability to monitor people, but the ability to preserve patterns long after the original moment has disappeared. One of the central constitutional concerns surrounding intelligence informant systems involves what legal scholars often call the chilling effect. Not direct censorship, not arrest or overt repression, but something a little quieter. The fear that participation itself may place an individual inside a permanent intelligence file. The fear that attending a meeting, signing a petition, or associating with the wrong organization may follow a person indefinitely. The Church Committee examined this problem extensively because intelligence investigations often collected information unrelated to criminal activity. People attended lawful meetings, discussed political ideas, participated in protests, and associated with controversial groups, and informants documented it all. The concern was not merely privacy in the modern technological sense, it's the possibility that surveillance changes civic behavior before the state ever acts directly. Which is an important point because societies don't require overt authoritarianism to become cautious. Sometimes uncertainty is enough. If individuals believe conversations are monitored, organizations infiltrated, and meetings are documented, many people will simply avoid participation altogether. And intelligence systems rarely become visible in real time. This is another critical point because many of these operations remain secret for years or decades because intelligence investigations often do not result in criminal prosecutions. Without court cases, the surveillance systems remain largely hidden. The public discovers the architecture afterward through a leaked document, congressional investigations, whistleblowers, or a declassified file, and then by that time, the systems have often already evolved into newer forms. The technology changes, the logic remains remarkably consistent. there is a tendency to imagine surveillance history as a sequence of isolated scandals, one administration or agency or one overreach. But the historical record suggests something different. That governments build intelligence systems during periods of instability because information reduces uncertainty, and once those systems demonstrate usefulness, they persist. Dropmire demonstrated how allied governments quietly monitor one another even inside supposedly secure spaces. The Ghetto Informant program demonstrated how domestic unrest transformed ordinary neighborhoods into intelligence environments. And the broader informant programs of the Cold War demonstrated how quickly surveillance expands once intelligence agencies begin pursuing total awareness rather than specific criminal evidence. And throughout all of it, the same underlying logic appears repeatedly. Prevent the crisis before it forms, map the network before it mobilizes, listen early and listen constantly. Because intelligence systems are built around one central fear of surprise, but there's another consequence. Over time, societies adapt to surveillance psychologically. People begin assuming their devices are compromised, their communications monitored, their organizations infiltrated, and their movements recorded. And eventually that assumption alters behavior even when nobody is actively listening at all. And that may be the most enduring legacy of all of these systems, not merely the files they created, but the atmosphere they left behind, because once a society becomes accustomed to the possibility of observation, silence itself begins changing shape. Anyway, that's all I have for this episode. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate, or write a review.
There is a signal broadcast every second of every day through our television sets.
Mark my words, AI is far more dangerous than nukes.
Science and technology are propelling us forward at accelerating rates.
Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.